Hi, and welcome to part 14 of my Python Programming for Beginners tutorial series. In today's video, we'll be looking at creating functions and a little bit into the scopes, so how declaring variables inside of functions and outside of functions, and the different ways to access those variables and modify those variables. Those would be like the global and local scopes related to functions. Functions are very useful, especially if you have a couple lines of code or a bunch of lines of code that you're going to have to call over and over again. Instead of rewriting those lines of code over and over again, you can simply create a function and then call that function. A lot of times as well, following like clean code, by all means, like I'm not a full expert on clean code, but I know that it's always best to kind of create functions for some of the things just to make it easier to read your code. Because something that may take 4 or 5 lines, if you could simply create a function called like get name, um, without taking any parameters, and that would get the name of the user instead of calling the input maybe a couple times to get some information from them. So we're going to be taking a look at that example and a few other examples. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So first, to create a function in Python, you're going to use the def keyword, which is basically define, and then you're going to create a function name. So I'm just doing like a brief outline here of what's in a function. And then in the parentheses, you would have parameter or parameters, and then you'd have your colon, and then you would have stuff inside function here. And then most likely it would end with a return statement. It doesn't have to include a return statement, but a lot of times functions do return um, a, a value, or you can print something to the screen if it's just a simple display function. So let's go ahead and let's create a function kind of like what I was saying before. We're going to call it get name. And we're not going to have any parameters for this function. I'm going to show you functions without parameters and functions with parameters just to kind of get the feel for them. And then we're going to be looking at the different scopes once we get into the parameters. So what would a function like get name really be used for? Maybe not specifically just get name, but maybe like get player info where they have to enter like their name, like their first name, their last name, maybe their age, or any other information that you might want. So we're just going to create a very simple function here. We're going to call a variable called first, and we're actually going to do first name here. We're going to do it in camel casing, and we're going to do input, and then we're going to put the prompt of what is your first name? And then we're going to create a variable called last name, and we're going to do that to input as well. And what is your last name? And then what we're going to do is we are going to return a f string literal. So what that is I can put curly brackets in and put my variables directly into the curly brackets instead of doing like a plus with some double quotes and wrapping some variables in there. This will just make it a little bit easier to write out. So if we do this here, and then we can simply call print get name, and let's see what this does. So it asked me for my first name, so let's just do jacked, and then we're going to do programmer here, and then we can see it outputs our first and last name combined. So what we could do as well is if we remove this here and we just do this and we do name equals get name, and then we can just print out name. And then let's put this one as Bob Smith here, and we have Bob Smith. So basically we ask the user for their first name and last name, and then we concatenate them into a string. So that's kind of the awesome thing about functions is if you wanted to do this um, in your code, you would have 3 lines in order to do it, or you could just simply ask for their full name, but then you would also have to consider them fully doing the input correctly. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong. And now we could even do what we've seen in our last video here, and we could simply strip these just to make sure that there's no leading um, white spaces or trailing white spaces. So that's really the basics of creating a function, is that define keyword or def keyword, the function name, the parameters, the colon, and then the real content of your function. So now we get into functions that have parameters. So we can do another def here, and then let's do a cube function. So basically that'll do anything to the power of 3 here. And then we're going to give our parameter the name of number. This could be anything you want. You could name it player, you could name it X, Z, I, P, J, anything you really want, but you're going to want to use names that are fairly easy to know um, what it is. This way, if you have to go back to your code and read it, you don't necessarily have to add a whole bunch of comments to see what it is that you're doing. Your code should really be readable without comments, and the comments should clarify anything or really kind of add reasoning of why you did something such a way. So let's go ahead and let's do this. Return number times 3, which is going to be cubing the function. So let's do cube and then 2. So we should see the number 8 here, which we do. Perfect. So what we could do here, and this is where the global and local scopes come into effect here. Let's say we had a result and we had 0 here, and we want to store the result of our cube function in a line here, but we don't want to do like there would be the very easy way of just doing result equals cube 2, but let's say we didn't want to do that and we wanted to modify the result directly, which is not recommended at all in Python or really any programming languages as far as I know. This should be avoided, but it is doable. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to do global result, and this will let you access the global variable of result, which is down here. And then you can do result equals number times 3, and then return result, or you don't even have to return the result at that point. You could simply do that, and then result, and then we're going to do cube 2, and we are not printing it, we are just executing the method as is. And here we can see that we do get 8 again. So we can see that it did modify our result variable because our result variable was 0. We call the cube function and it modifies our result. Now, what if we did this? If we did So if we did this here, what would we think that the outcome would be? So if we run this now, we can see that our result is still 0. So even though we have the result variable here and we have the result variable here, it does not know about this variable. Now the only thing is, now this is trying to edit the variable. So something about Python, which is kind of odd, I would say, is that in theory, I could do print result and not have a problem. So let's set this result here to 100. And then we are just going to print it there. Now what we might have to do is we might have to do this here. I believe that that should let us print it, but I'm not 100% positive. So if we do, yes, so let's actually just bring this back down here. I just had a typo here. So let's just do print result, and then we're just going to be returning the number here. So we could just ignore this here. So if we look at this, we get 100 and 100 back. We never get our cubed because we're just returning it. But if we did print cube 2, so we have 100, just try to get 100, 8, and 100. So what that is here is we have our result equals to 100, and then we call the print on the function of cube with the number of 2. Now this calls this function, and the first thing that we do is print result. Now it'll actually go and access the global variable of result and print it, and then return number times 3, which is the cubed version. And then we go ahead and we print that out, which is going to be 8. And then we print out result once again, and it is still equal to 100 because we have it up here. But now if we try to do result is equal to number times 3, we're also going to get an error here because this is now a local variable because we are trying to define it here, and that just will not work. So there are definitely a few little quirks there. So what you could do is you could do that. And then if we did this here, and then results. So just by changing it, we see that we fixed that error. But now what's going to happen is actually quite interesting. So if we do this, okay, we still have the print at the bottom there. Perfect. All right, so let's execute this code here. All right, so what we have here is we define our result as 100, and then we do a print cube with the number of 2. So we go into this function with the cube number of 2. We get result equals number cubed, which is going to be 8 in our case because 2 to the power of 3 is 8. And then we go ahead and we print that result. Now, because result is the local variable to this function, because it was declared inside the function without the global keyword, it will print out 8, and then we return number cubed, and then we print that out, which is going to be 8, and then we print result, which is still going to be at 100 because we only modified the local version of result in this function. So those are definitely some gotchas in the Python functions with global and local variables. So you're definitely going to want to be very, very careful if you ever use the global keyword in a function, because this will actually allow you to change the global variable. Because now if I do this, we have now every single value is set to 8. We have lost this value of 100 because we modified it in the function. So this is definitely a lot to take in compared to some of our other videos here with Python, but definitely take some time, definitely rewatch this video, do some examples on your own as well, like create a function um, to do some different math equations. I'm trying to think of some, like if you wanted to do like get the value of the slope on a function, or simply just do like an add, subtract, multiplication. Like if you did a define and then add, and we have num1, num2. Give that a shot. Do some coding on this. Um, Maybe create some global variables and modify those global variables and just kind of play around with it to really kind of understand the differences. But I would definitely recommend, if you're ever working on a program, unless you really need to modify the global variables, I would avoid using the global keyword and simply use the return And then if you really have to modify a variable outside of your function, return the results and simply just call the function and then go ahead and print out that result here. That'll just ensure that you are not messing with different global variables. You're not editing the state of your application outside of the functions. What you see in the function is exactly what you get. You don't get any like side effects. So this is definitely the safer route to avoid the global keyword and just calling the function to the variable outside of the function. So that's really it for functions. In our next videos, we are going to be looking at reading and writing files. So that should be interesting. We'll be able to take in some text files and output to some text files, which is really useful for different logging functions. And then importing files is really useful just for some data manipulation, or if you have some files for games, like if you have all your enemies in a file, we can import them that way. So make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, hit that notification bell to be alerted when that video comes out, and I will see you on the next video.